Alright, last phase, or well, I guess you call it last phase of the construction. It's time to test the Scubaboo board itself. Make sure, one, I know the board already works. The reason why I know that is because Tim, when he puts the boards together, he tests them before they go out. He doesn't ship anything that doesn't work. So I trust Tim enough to know that these boards work. Now, what I'm going to be testing on here are my relay functions. In other words, the switches. I am not going to be worrying about the sound on it. Basic reasoning is I have no sound programmed onto the MP3 player. That I'll test at a later date. If you wanted to load up sound on the MP3 player and test it too, at this point you could. But my main function is I want to make sure the Scubaboo board itself is working. For this test, I'm going to do it with the lid off so I can see inside, make sure everything fires. Now, when Tim tests these boards, he does a simple program. You know, just basically pushing the switches to make sure all the different switches in here are going to fire. And when the switches fire, there's a red LED that will come on for each switch. Okay. Now, I could just plug it in and just see if the red LEDs are come on or flash. And that would tell me the board's working. That would not tell me whether my switches on the outside here for the relays or for the sensor are working, because I added to the board. So I'm testing. I want to test my switches here. I need to make sure all my solder joints I did on the tabs on the switches are good, and I also need to make sure all my wires attached to the board are seated right too. So when I'm doing the testing, if something, I'm using green and blue LEDs, if nothing comes on, I know one of the wires, you know, either has a bad solder joint or isn't seated right in the thing and needs to be adjusted. That's basically all I'm testing right now. Now, to do that, like I said, I've got 4 green and 4 blue spotlights out here that I've made in the past. I've used these for a couple years in the hunt, so I know these work just fine. And what I'm going to do is I'm doing the green at right now, and I'm going to attach those, the positive lead off of it, to the bottom row of switches. 4 green LEDs, I've got the positive wires attached to the switches. Now I'm going to repeat the process for the blue. All 4 of the blue are now attached. Okay, now at this point that should leave your top switch clear, and that's where you put your power in. Now I went and I took some scrap wire and I cut out 4 pieces, so it's going to be one piece to each switch. Now that I've got everything hooked into the switches, it's time to get them connected up to power. Okay, I got my 4 blue LEDs here and my 4 green LEDs here. Now the last step before you turn on any sort of power to this is you need to get your wall wart, which Tim includes with the pack, with the board when he mails them to you. Get that out. And I'm plugging the wall wart into the jack on the side of the case. Now, I just turned on my power. Okay. And you notice with the power on, and I got a blue in there apparently instead of a green, but I've got 3 green LEDs and a blue LED. These are the ones attached to your bottom rail. When you have nothing on other than your 12-volt power supply for your lighting, these are the ones we'll show. The other bundle here is off. Now when I plug in the wall wart, the board will automatically sequence through any programming that's on the chip. So these lights should start flashing. Right now what it's telling me with just these 4 on is the bottom set of switches on the side of the case are wired correctly. Now we plug in the board and see what happens. And nothing is happening. So that tells me right there I do not have a good connection in my power line, which means I need to flip this thing around as far as I can and take a look here at the Scubaboo board. And I'm wiggling the wires a little bit. In fact, I am going to pull out the wiring and double check it all. Okay, I may have hooked up my power lines backwards, and if that's the case, and I think it might be, because the green LED is not on the wall wart. Nope. So I am going to redo my connections. I've got a bad connection somewhere. I'm wondering, before I go messing with the board, if I need to check my connections here. And that would be a easy enough fix. Okay, well, I am going to get my connections tested here. Okay, I ended up with a loose connection in the bundle here where the wall wart, the wire from the board, and the wire from the amplifier came in. So I basically just snipped off what I have there and rewired it, and now now it appears to be working. I have not tested the sensor yet, but right now I'm turning on power from my power supply to my LEDs, and you'll see I've got a blur here. That's 4 LEDs, and then right next to it I've got 4 that are off. We have the sensor hooked up. Now we're going to plug this in. Let it sit for a couple of seconds. Okay, let's see here. I've got lights on the MP3 player. No, and my power light for the amplifier is now on. I've got power to the MP3 player. The board is doing nothing with that plugged in. So I'm going to unplug the sensor for now. Okay. Okay, I went and unplugged the sensor because the board was not reacting. So that's telling me I've got a problem with my sensor. But I want to make sure the board itself is working. I got a steady yellow light. And if you notice, the light's changed there. I'm actually programming it. Now I've got a light not coming on for relay 2. Okay, I reprogrammed the board to a pattern that I can use with the lights. And while testing it, my second switch here, I'm thinking it's in one of the connections. It's either the wire is not seated right in the socket, or I've got a loose soldering joint up on the tab. So now I've got to get it adjusted. And I suggest when you're doing any wire attachments or anything, make sure your power's off. So I'm just taking the wire out and taking a look at it. I want to make sure it was in the socket, working or seated correctly. All the rest of the wiring looks good in this so far. I still gotta test out that sensor, and I think I might have a problem with that sensor too. Okay, I've cleaned off the wire, retwisted it, and I'm putting it back into the socket and tightening that screw down. I may not have had the screw down tight enough to make a connection on that wire correctly. It's in there tight now. Now I'm going to plug it back in. Everything is coming on as intended. Amplifier lights on, MP3 lights are on. Now what I've done so far is I've tested the relay. All the relays are firing as they should, but the one's giving me problems is this one here, number 2. And the green LEDs, which are on this top row here, they're on and turning off and on as intended. Or I should say the top row is the power for the LEDs. What I'm thinking is I've checked the wire for the switch. It's in its seat and seated tightly. I've checked the outside of it where the wire plugs into the switch, and it's in there and seated tightly. So that would normally tell me that where it's attached to the switch itself is not making a connection, which means I need to get my soldering iron out and clean up that connection and resolder that wire. Okay, I checked the seating on the wire, or was hooking into the actual switch, and I also resoldered the connection. Light was still not coming on, and that was my fault. The LED I had hooked up was this one here, and there was a problem with the LED. So make sure when you go to test things, whatever you're using to test the board with actually work. I didn't do that. I assumed they worked because they all worked last year. That one didn't. There's something wrong with it. So now when I tripped the board to go off, that one went off, on. Off, on. Off, on. Off and on. That's all 4 switches. So, as you can see, the board works now with the LEDs on. Now the only other thing, I have 2 other things, and like I said a little bit ago, I need to test. One is the amplifier with the sound. For that, I'll do it later because I gotta get music up on the board. But for right now, I am gonna unplug things and turn things off so I can get these wires re-tucked down where they need to be. And I'm going to get the sensor plugged in, make sure it's plugged in correctly, and that's for this piece here. Now I know the board will trip manually if I push the test button on the board, or if I have the bridge in, the board will automatically test depending on what type of delay the board is set with, which I have no idea. But for my hunt, I want to use a sensor. So now I need to test the sensor. And to do that, we'll turn the light LEDs back on and we'll plug the board back in. Give it a second. Now I'm not sure what's causing this. The board, the MP3 player's on, but the board is dead when I plug the sensor in. Might have a short in the wiring someplace on the sensor, which could be causing the board to act a little wonky. Now I'm going to plug the sensor back in again, and before I do that, I'm going to make sure I have my wires hooked up right to it. Black to the black socket, red to the red socket, and white to the white socket. I know my connection from the outside plug on here to the plug on the board is correct. I've tested that. Now my old boards, when I first plugged it in, it takes the sensor a couple of seconds to warm up, but it always tripped the board and the prop would do what it's supposed to do. The board is not tripping when I plug it in. The only thing I can think of is when I've added the extension on here, I've got a bad joint someplace and something is arcing out. That's the only other thing I can think of. Either that or I have this plugged in backwards. In which case, that could be true. So I'll just flip the jack around and we'll find out. I've just turned the power supply off to the LEDs. We know we got the LEDs working. Now the board is totally dead except for the MP3 player when I have the sensor connected. Okay, I'm unplugging the sensor, and now the board's firing. Okay, so that's telling me I've got something wrong between the plug here that plugs into the board and the sensor itself. Because when I unplug it, the board does actually fire when I hit the test switch. You can see the red lights flashing in there, hopefully. That's the relays tripping. So I've got a connection problem here somewhere. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to unscrew the sensor from the box. It's the only connection on the outside of the box where you need a screwdriver. And we're just going to undo that. And I'm going to take the sensor totally out of the equation with the exception of the plug for the inside. I'm going to plug that in. Just make sure it's plugged in correctly. Okay, diagnosis on this board again. That's the wires leading to the sensor here. And I've unplugged the sensor. So the sensor's totally out of the equation. And there's a little test button if you know which one to press. The board is firing just fine. In other words, all the relays are going off when I hit the test button, which it wasn't when this was plugged in. Now, when I put the sensor together with I put an extension on it, it was one of the last things I did the other night. So I'm wondering if I've got a bad connection in here somewhere. Because you should be able to put 25 feet of wire on that sensor. I've done it in the past, Scuba's done it, and it's worked just fine. So what I'm going to have to do is it's going to be a thing of trial and error. I've got two connections on here, one at this end for this little pigtail that attaches to the box, and another one at the other end that goes to the sensor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip this section off, and I'm just going to re-solder my connections. And before I clip the end off, clip it apart and just redo it, I am going to take a look at it, make sure it's not cross-connecting or something. Okay, on the sensor, what I ended up doing is, well, I kind of explained what I did. I ended up snipping the two connections on the sensor and redoing them. I'm thinking what had happened is when I did those connections, I used a liquid electrical tape on them, and I didn't let it dry hard enough. And then when I wrapped them with the electrical tape, it smushed the connections together and it was cross-connecting. This is my first time with using electrical tape, so I'm not used to it. I probably should have held off on this project. But anyway, as you can see, I got the LEDs working, or power's back on. Now I also have the sensor hooked up. When I go to plug the wall wart in, the board should automatically fire and send the LEDs through their pattern. It does that because that's how it's warming up the sensor. So it should automatically trip when I plug this in. And if it does, then the board's working correctly. So we plug it in, and there it goes. The board's automatically tripping, warming up the sensor, and the LEDs are flashing as I have it programmed. Now that it's gone through its whole run, I've got the sensor out here, and I just wave my hand over it, and the sensor is tripping the board, causing the board to run its program. Okay, so yep, there we go. So the board, for all intents and purposes, is working and is ready to go, minus the MP3 player. I still gotta get my sound on the MP3 player. Just haven't, that's my next step. Now, when you put these boards together, you're gonna have some, or into a case, you are gonna have some problems, especially if you're just getting started. For me, I had one LED that was bad, which was causing the problem. I had my connections on the sensor, which were bad, and I needed to redo, and I just tripped it again. And I used liquid electrical tape again over on the power connection. So that was bad. I had to fix those three things. It just takes a while to diagnose it sometimes. And there's a series of steps. But anyway, that's pretty much what's involved with putting these boards into a box. It's fairly straightforward. It just gets a little hard when you have to diagnose a problem if something's not making a connection. But even that's pretty easy. But there you go. That's how you put a Scubaboo board into a watertight container for your haunt. Hopefully this will help you guys all out. Hopefully I didn't drone on too much. And with that, we're going to say stay spooky and stay toxic.